Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Alright, welcome to the Reading Theatre, and today we're working, of course, Counter-Revolution 1776, Chapter 9. Abolition in London, Somerset's Case and the North American Aftermath. The Reading Theatre. Exactly. Somerset's Case and the North American Aftermath. As things turned out, June 1772 was not only on a level with July 1776 as a determinant of the future of British North America, but, in a sense, was a necessary stepping stone to the latter. Better, recognized date. Slaveholders had long felt uncomfortable in London, objecting to disapproval there of their brutal floggings of their Africans and the perceived laggardness in retrieving runaways. As Somerset's case dragged on, more antipathy to slavery was engendered in the British Isles, further outraging colonists, who had normalized this form of property as any other, like a steed or a parrot. When abolitionist Granville Sharp bashed colonists in this regard, Benjamin Franklin struck back vigorously. When, days after Gaspé, the decision was rendered in Somerset's case, and it was reported as ending slavery, the insecurity of slaveholders increased, while the self-assertion of the enslaved had a similar uptick. Some of the enslaved took the case as a cue to flee, with some seeking to make it all the way to London. While Charles Carroll of Maryland, one of the richest men in the colonies, experienced difficulty in disciplining his cocksure property, almost from the time the case was rendered. Influential personalities in the metropolis were beginning to recoil at the enslaving habit of the colonists, spawning mutual rage that was not restrained when the latter began to argue that they, the settlers, were being treated like slaves by London. Lost in the furor was the judge's limited decision, freeing an enslaved African belonging to a settler who had escaped to the metropolis. The Crown and the colonies might have been able to downplay this decision, taken alone, but giving the proceedings real and imagined slights, not importation agreements, reluctant mainland conscripts, the specter of unleashing armed Africans against the settlers, it was not easy for an already tattered relationship to survive. Colonists refused to be short-sighted and insisted rightfully that just because the decision was limited to England did not mean that London would refuse for all time to extend its substance across the Atlantic. James Somerset, the ostensible cause of this turmoil, though catapulted to fame in London, was born in Africa, and was carted to Virginia by a slaver in 1749. At which time Charles Stuart, a merchant of Scottish origin residing in Norfolk, purchased him. Somerset then moved to Stuart's behest to Boston, then to Britain. That this case was seen as influencing the fate of slavery as a whole is evidenced by Stuart's revelation that not himself, but the West Indian planters and merchants were paying the fees for this case. That this case was seen as embodying multiple ramifications was suggested by Somerset's multiple domiciles and especially his 4-year stay in Boston, where African insurgency seemed to be rising. Stuart, on the other hand, had distinguished himself earlier in the eyes of London by performing civilities to the Spaniards in 1763, after which Francis Frackwire told him, quote, I will provide notice of your intention of going to London, who I doubt will not show you all civilities, unquote. Which in retrospect seems like anticipatory sarcasm. The case that June 1772 prompted, a tsunami of abolitionism, started innocently enough. According to Counsel for the Enslaved, it was on the 3rd of December 1771 that the slave known as James Somerset was found to be shackled on a ship in the Thames bound westward destination. When this matter was revealed to anti-bondage advocates, he had been bought in Virginia originally, but his tendency to bold led his masters to seek to sell him in Jamaica, hence his being found on the Thames. A writ of habeas corpus was drawn up demanding that the body, quote unquote, be produced before the courts. Somerset's counsel did little to suppress the concerns of slaveholders about the far-reaching nature of this case. Slavery produced a horrid train of evils, he argued, and if not checked, would proliferate in London. Not just spreading from our own colonies, said counsel, but from Eastern Europe and Africa too, with destructive consequences, quite dangerous to the state. In words that colonists should have heeded, he warned that those who were excluded from the common benefits of the Constitution are interested in scheming its destruction, unquote. And anybody familiar with the Maroon Wars in Jamaica or the history of South Carolina would know why he referred contemptuously to this pernicious institution that was slavery. Welcome back, Cinnamon. This case, as much as any other, demarcated the yawning gap between the colonies and the metropolis, underlining an identity in the former that was boldly different from the latter. This case, as much as any other, defined the emerging view which was to characterize the Republic's key leaders, a defense of slavery, which confronted awkwardly the Crown's long-term interests in Cartagena, Havana, and St. Augustine. This case, combined with the November 1775 bombshell dropped by Lord Dunmore in Virginia, when he threatened to unleash armed Africans on a brewing revolt against the Crown, solidified opposition to London, ushered into existence a new republic, and ossified for decades to come a caste-like status for Africans, seen widely among settlers as thinly disguised revolutionaries eager to collaborate with foes of all sorts to subvert the status quo. Understandably, the only fitting rebuke for revolutionaries bent on abolishing private property, albeit in themselves, was a steely counter-revolution. The reading public had plenty of opportunity to parse the details of what came to be referred to as Somerset's case, which helped to harden the notion that London favored the enslaved over the slaveholder. This was understandable, since, as the historian James Welvin sees it, this case, quote, in effect, meant that the enslavement was outlawed in England, which illuminates why so many Africans were familiar with Lord Mansfield's opinion. Thus, Understandably, the case was much discussed in Virginia, both in the press and face to face. It was reported in at least 13 British newspapers, several widely circulated magazines, and almost 24 newspapers in North America. Contemporary analysis felt it had implications not just for the British Isles, but its possessions too, and it is this perception that served to fuel anti London sentiment, which was to detonate in 1776. Historian Stephen N. Wise argues that this case, quote, was even more influential in America than in London, with one observer at that time concurring while moaning that the case would cheat an honest American of his slave, unquote. Morning, Sam, welcome in. Historian Michael Groth, his point in asserting that, quote, in one sense, slaveholding patriots went to war in 1775 and declared independence in 1776 to defend their right to own slaves, unquote. Actually, newspaper readers had much to ponder generally, notably in the Keystone Colony that was Virginia, for there headlines blared about Africans being armed by London and Paris, suing for freedom in Scotland, and, naturally, plotting revolt in Jamaica. It would be easy for settlers to perceive that the worm was turning, that they were surrounded by Africans who could easily be enlisted by the colonizer to squash their incipient revolt. A perception that seemed to be realized in November 1775 with the remarkable edict of Lord Dunmore. Unsurprisingly, the monumentous decision of 22nd of June 1772 was not embraced warmly by the majority of settlers. On the other hand, a Manhattan journal reported with skepticism about how on that pivotal day in London, quote, a great many other blacks came before Lord Mansfield, who had delivered the opinion of the court, and bowed first to the judges and then to the bar, with, quote, symptoms of the most extravagant joy, unquote. This appreciation of Mansfield may have been a personal signal to this jurist who had a young Negro woman living as a member of his family, generally unthinkable in North America. Not to mention his being a powerful Scot, a part of the kingdom that was to distinguish itself as a fount of abolition. Following Mansfield's opinion, more cases followed his precedent, indicating that the appreciation of these Africans was well placed. A self-described quote-unquote West Indian said in 1772 that the case was a, quote, full concern to America, and it had engrossed much of the general expectation, unquote, which could have well applied to both the Caribbean and the mainland, where it was announced portentously that was a case of not of slavery, but of property. More than this, a type of property authorized by Parliament, and, quote, if property, therefore in Negroes, was repugnant to the law of England, it could not be the law of America, unquote. What next? Judicial activism abolishing private property in general? What was needed was both a strengthening of the demos, or at least those who were property owners and slaveholders, and strengthening of parliamentary-style bodies, both of which were to be the calling cards for rebels in 1776. Moreover, it was announced forebodingly this case could well stir insurrections in America. And what about the impact in the homeland? This writer had traveled to France and saw hardly any Africans, a result of a conscious policy, since Paris was concerned that, quote, otherwise the race of Frenchmen would in time to come be changed, unquote. In stark contrast to London. But now, with this decision, the sluice gates would be open, and Africans would now arrive in waves, meaning stain and contamination, unquote. Not to mention the undoing of revenue producing colonies. Hey Kay, welcome in, comrade. Salute. We're just working on a read. Gearld Horne, Counter-Revolution 1776, Chapter 9. Edward Long of Jamaica, who knew more than most how easy it was to rile up slaves, argued passionately that with this legal decision, quote, slaveholding might perhaps be very well discontinued in every province of the North American continent, unquote. And surely it would harm profitability. More than this, it was a, quote, direct invitation to the Africans in the hemisphere to mutiny or flee to London. They would bribe captains to flee, thereby corrupting the well-wrought and profoundly crucial system of transport. It would empower competitors, especially Paris, and tear the empire apart. A newspaper in Boston was among those that worried about the case's implications. Journalists there may have learned about the enthusiastic reception for the Negro poet Phillis Wheatley in London, which astonished even her. Man, I welcome in, comrade. Samuel Eswick, not known to be one of her supporters and a confidant of planters in Barbados, felt that the case would inspire slave insurrections, which was understandable since they had been spurred by much less. Another pro-slavery advocate said that slavery in the Americas was just a form of villainage, and this institution continued in full bloom even after the Magna Carta. Besides, Georgia was a negative example of societies that barred slavery, bringing economic stagnation, and in any case, it did not deter other powers from pursuing enslavement. But in the long run, it was Wheatley, not Eswick, whose perception about London's attitudes were more incisive. For it was in England that abolitionists pressed for her freedom. And her wariness about how this new status would be viewed in Boston was underscored when she requested that a copy of her document of liberty be safely stowed in Europe, which could allow her to escape the benign colonies for a more enlightened home. Other Africans in the colonies acceded, Wheatley in actual seeking to escape to London, with their erstwhile masters left behind arguing that this London decision had spurred their wanderlust. One in this group was Abel, 40 years old, 6 feet tall, literate, a violinist and pilot. I have whipped him, his master confessed, unashamedly. I believe scars may be seen upon his body as a result. He had been to England and now wanted to return. This attempted flight to freedom was reflected of the anomaly of the era. Settlers saw escaping from London as the goal, while Africans saw escaping to London as the objective. One scholar of this era, who argued that in this volatile context, it, quote, was often the slaves who incited the British. African American initiatives began in the fall of 1774, when very few white Americans were angry enough at British to favor independence, unquote. Before that, Abigail Adams found that a group of enslaved Africans in her province planned to make a proposal that if they were freed, they would take up arms against the settlers. There was a, quote, conspiracy of the Negroes, she warned her spouse, the future U.S. president. The enslaved in Bristol County, Rhode Island, joined the Loyalists too. John Adams should not have been surprised by this turn of events. After all, he had served long and faithfully as a counsel for slaveholders, and once argued that Massachusetts presumed all Africans to be slaves. In the fall of 1774, James Madison had anticipated Dunmore's edict, noting that only recently a few of those unhappy wretches, meaning Africans, met together to conspire with redcoats on the premise that by revolting, then they should be rewarded with their freedom. Madison's Madison's interlocutor. This word's bugging me now. Interlocutor. He keeps using this word and I keep having trouble pronouncing it. I know what it means, I just can't pronounce it. William Bradford agreed that there was a well founded apprehension about an insurrection being excited among the slaves, but hoped against hope that London would disdain such a slavish way of conquering. Coincidence or not, it did seem that Africans were spurred to heightened activism after June 1772. In Boston, in early 1773, a group of Africans in petitioning for freedom contrasted sharply their treatment with the treatment of Africans by Spaniards, who supposedly did not possess the sublime ideas of freedom the Englishmen have, and yet acquitted themselves better in this regard. Speaking in behalf of their fellow slaves in this province, they expressed a desire to return to Africa. Peter Best and his much besieged African comrades would have found that in Boston, those who were pro-London often represented the enslaved in court, while rebels routinely represented masters. Repeatedly, Africans in Boston and their backers denounced the anomaly of rebels prattling about liberty while endorsing enslavement. Why, said one commenter in 1773, this was a sheer solecism of language. There was not a right to bring them from their own country, it was said of the beleaguered Africans, and thus they ought to be returned thereto at the public expense, if they choose it, which doubtless would be the case with many. Unquote. Appealing directly to the province's governor, the Africans, in a cry that resounded even more insistently after the founding of the Republic, seemed desperate enough to throw in their lot with the crown in return for concessions. Quote, we have no property, we have no wives, no children, we have no city, no country. Unquote. Manhattan in particular had good reason to worry about this turbulent drift of events. For much of the 18th century, New York City held the largest percentage and the second largest absolute number of enslaved Africans of any port town in British North America. This demographic imbalance fed shivers about the long-range ambitions of Africans. When, in 1774, amid violent scenes of loyalist reprisals against rebels, 2 slaves murdered their masters, known supporters of the rebel cause, fright rose about a crushing maneuver by a London African Axis. Well, I've heard that one before. They just don't understand freedom like we do. Yeah. Weird how far back that goes, huh? Some settlers were beginning to see the revolt against British rule not only as a thrust towards independency, opening even more the growing profitable trade in Hispaniola and France, but as a simple attempt at survival in the face of a perceived attempt at their liquidation propelled by London and Africans alike. The planter class was explosively angry about Lord Mansfield's demarche as a result, with one among them claiming that now, quote, slaveholding might perhaps be very well discontinued in every province of the North American continent situated to the north of the Carolinas, unquote. what would now befall the slave traders who had piled into this odious business with the shriveling of the Royal African Company. Echoing the democratic sounding rhetoric emanating from the mainland, it was stated that the legal opinion thwarted Parliament and was a kind of unwarranted judicial activism. Worse, it was thought, the end result would be miscreation, creating individuals like the Portuguese and Moriscos in complexion of skin and basement of mind, quote unquote, a venomous and dangerous ulcer. In other words, the result would be bloodshed and a spirit of mutiny and untold horrors. Even before June 1772, one Londoner complained that Africans, quote, do not certainly consider themselves to be slaves in this country, nor will they put up with inequality of treatment, unquote. The number of Africans in the Isles was estimated to be 15,000. But Granville Sharp, the abolitionist, thought it was higher, perhaps 20,000. Some Londoners found it disturbing that some of these African men were marrying English women, while the major planter Edward Long complained that, quote, the lower class of women in England are remarkably fond of the blacks, unquote. God damn, it's 1774? Jesus, fuck. And white people still sound the same today. What the fuck, Kyles and Karens? Raising this dreaded specter of miscreation. Contrary to Long's fondest hope, this was, in a conservative sense, an indication of the danger of allowing slavery to fester. God damn, white people have been cringe a long time, haven't they? Anticipating conflicts between London and Washington that would animate the early 19th century, a propagandist wondered what would happen if a slave ship bound for the mainland from Africa somehow was blown into England. Would this property be confiscated? Was it not dangerous to have one set of laws in the metropolis and another in the colonies? Was this not simply deepening a split, virtually mandating formal separation? And what about the reputed 15,000 Africans in the British Isles? Would not their numbers increase to the point where the kingdom would be transformed? To close observers, it may have seemed already that London's emissaries on the mainland were exhibiting shakiness on the bedrock issue of slavery. When an African was sold in Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts displayed a remarkable solicitude towards this man's claim that he was actually born free in Lisbon. Instead of dismissing the claim peremptorily, Hutchinson sought the aid of the Earl of Dartmouth in resolving the matter. Yet another London-based analyst observed that though, quote, the number of Negroes in the southern colonies of North America is equal, if not superior, to that of the white men, their condition is truly pitiable. Their labor excessively hard, their diet poor and scanty, their treatment cruel and oppressive. Unquote. Red Falcon, welcome, comrade. Great to see you. Everybody follow Falcon, please. In itself, this was a simple quotidian truth, though rarely acknowledged on the mainland. But the conclusion was the point that was driving thoroughgoing change. Quote, they, slaves, cannot but be, it was reported ominously, a subject of terror to those who so inhumanely terrorize over them. Unquote. I've seen you stream. I've seen it happen. It might be a rare occurrence, but I've seen it happen. James Swan, a Scot writing in Boston, also spoke of the odious nature of slavery in the eyes of every British subject. With eloquence, he denounced the crimes attending the slave trade and the extreme cruel usage the Negroes meet with their plantations. Unquote. Virginia was singled out. My blood runs cold at the thought, he declaimed. In a growing trend signaling a growing dispute, he assailed bitterly the hypocrisy of slaveholders bemoaning lack of freedom. Rob streamed once too, yeah. Rob streams for an hour or two here and there. Do I need it? Should I make a tag? Rob Rizzo, Rob Rizzo, Rob Rizzo, refugees welcome. Oh, Rob. Now Rob is extremely elusive, okay? Rob is an elusive creature that you want to make sure that you have that bell turned on for, because there's some goddamn good streams in Rob's. I love watching the art, and there's like a cool little thing where you can even draw on the screen. Follow Robin Blind, everybody. Rob is a cryptid. Why, one could just as well, he stressed, start making slaves of British subjects, if this dirty business was not halted. Setting at liberty those who were enslaved was his abolitionist demand, though his failure to detail compensation for slaveholders reified the view that those of his ilk were the dangerous radicals whose jurisdiction settlers must escape. Rob is actually Tall Man. See, here it's not Tall Man. There's something. I mean, I don't know enough about Tall Man, but we have Glooscap here, which in my mind seems similar, but we have Glooscap, which seems similar to Tall Man. There's definitely some differences, but Glooscap is like sort of our version of that. That would be fitting if Rob was Glooscap. And these scalding analyses of slavery, these opinion molders, were simply reflecting on. Sorry. Let me try that one again. In these scalding analyses of slavery, these opinion molders were simply reflecting the considered opinions among a goodly number of Africans, including the soon to be renowned memoirist Odela Equano. This fabled African arrived in London weeks after the Somerset case was rendered, providing him with a ringside seat at the making of history. Equiano also spent a good deal of time in Belfast, and not coincidentally, by the late 1760s, anti slavery sentiment there had hardened. Like Equiano, Ignatius Sancho wanted a harder line taken against the rebels. Sancho was so hostile to the rebels that he seemed to skew reality to make it fit his fond hope that they would be defeated. Equiano's and Sancho's anti-rebel sentiments were mirrored at the highest levels, for it was Maurice Morgan, top aide to Sir Guy Carleton, who in 1772 published one of the first proposals for gradual abolition. It was becoming commonplace for leaning intellectuals in London to find it painfully ironic that brutalizing mainland slaveholders were in the vanguard of those yelping for liberty. Quite typically, these abolitionists, most notably the heroic James Ramsay, were often quite hostile to what were seen as hypocritical cries for liberty by slaveholders. Their anger may have come to a boil when Virginia's eminent Richard Henry Lee compared the situation of his fellow colonists to Egyptian bondage, which could very well, quote, become the fate of every inhabitant of America, that is, every white inhabitant. Ramsay, says one scholar, hated American rebels. According to a Nigerian authority on these matters, quote, Englishmen who had not lived in the West Indies and America had not been so deprived by plantation mentality, and were thus enabled to accord some degree of humanity to black chattels, quote unquote. Hence Lord Manfield's decision and the negative reaction to it due west. The Somerset case both reflected and propelled this growing abolitionist sentiment in London. Plans for abolition were being devised, as well as plans to circumscribe the slave trade. One bold Londoner envisioned the time, quote, when the blacks of the southern colonies on the continent of America shall be numerous enough to throw off at once the yoke of tyranny, to revenge their wrongs on the blood of their oppressors, and carry terror and destruction to a more northern settlements, unquote. Hell yeah, let's go. This insurrection on the continent would then provide incitement in the islands and a signal for a general and merited carnage, featuring horrible cruelties and the most furious revenge, which may end to the disadvantage of the whites. Unquote. The issue was buried. The issue was broodied of settling free Africans in Florida, which would have recreated the pre-1763 problem faced in Georgia and the Carolinas, of slaves north of St. Augustine finding refuge. Quote, colonies of free Negroes, tied to London, would shake the power of Spain to its foundation. Unquote. That is, settlers' foundational interests were to be sacrificed in the process. If settlers had gotten hold of this inflammatory pamphlet, they would have been justified in viewing it as an ominously dangerous straw in the wind. Now it was not just the enslaved of Antigua contemplating the liquidation of settlers. This chilling denouncement was now being discussed in ostensibly more respectable sites in London. In such a context, independency, ousting London, adopting a truer whiteness by calling for a formal truce in the religious Cold War, and thereby broadening the base of support for the new republic, seemed like common sense driven by the mandate to survive. With a bow to predictability, London's interests were sacrificed in 1776 by the settlers. Still, this fiery rhetoric was becoming the rage among London's abolitionists, who found it easier to clamor for total abolition of slavery, while their mainland counterparts leaned toward gradualism. Nonetheless, there was a relationship between abolitionists on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly the tie between Granville Sharp and Anthony Benezet. The latter thought that the rebelliousness of Africans meant that, quote, some of the colonies could fall under the dominion of their slaves in the Caribbean and could awaken settlers of the alarms of danger they faced, unquote. But Benezet also knew that the cost of an African was increasing along with the growth in rice and indigo production in South Carolina and Georgia, meaning the arrival of even more Africans. 10,000 were expected, he said, in the spring of 1773, tellingly exposing his justifiable concern. Quote, the colonies appear so stupefied and their hearts so hardened by the love of the gain, he moaned, that it is feared nothing less than a blow from the heaven will rouse them from their lethargy, unquote. Actually, It was the double blow from Somerset and Dunmore that roused them, though not necessarily for the better. The rage of settlers notwithstanding, Lord Mansfield's decision was not necessarily a radical break from the train of history, but more a logical progression. The siege of Havana and previous battles in Cartagena had shown that in the immediate future, London would need more, not fewer, Africans in its contestation with the Catholic powers. And it did not require a fortune teller to discern that arming Africans in order to keep other Africans enslaved was not a sustainable project in the long term. Moreover, the Maroon Wars in Jamaica showed that if something sufficiently severe was not done, the entire colonial project could be lost. The frecklessness of mainlanders when it came to fighting, deserting, mutinying, trading with the enemy, hinting broadly about independency, indicated that other options should be explored. The undercutting the source of their wealth, which had boosted independency in the first place, that is, enslaving Africans, did seem to be an appropriate rejoinder. Then there was a growth of abolitionist sentiment in London and Scotland, which seemed to be gaining in strength with every passing day, and was driven in no small measure by the riotous obstreperiousness of Africans themselves. My dad is like big officer from Reservation Dogs. I can imagine that. In any case, as early as 1748, Virginians had reason to argue that just because a mainland slave was in London did not mean manumission ipso facto. Okay, Mama, have a good stream, comrade. In 1749, Dudley Crofts, a Caribbean slaveholder, had asked if the status of his slave property was altered as a result of his being in England. Lord Mansfield's ruling was 2 decades away, but the fact that the question had to be asked then was indicative of changing times. About a decade after Croft's inquiry, a verbal war had erupted in London between the pro slavery lobby and its growing list of detractors. In a sense, this was a reflection of the reality that as the slave trade surged in the prelude to 1776, more Africans were turning up in the Isles, further stoking debate. The legal status of slavery in London was contested long before 1776, as suggested by the clandestine sneaking of Equiano into town in 1762, underscoring the reality that the master did not feel he had an unquestioned right to sell his property. Everybody follow our comrade Mama M Media, please. Given the venom directed at Lord Dunmore subsequently, the momentous year of 1775 had begun ironically with public addresses of praise to the governor for his determined attitude towards the indigenous in Virginia. Lord Dunmore had not stinted in confronting indigenes, but as a faithful servant of the crown, he diligently opposed efforts of colonists to move westward, seizing land of the indigenes, to the contestation of the settlers. But as Lord Dunmore became the first full-fledged villain of the rebels, denizens of the Dominion came to believe that he was seeking to incite indigenes against them too, which may have stemmed from the perception that he was obstructing land grabs. In assessing Lord Dunmore, colonists had a lengthy record to draw upon. Even before his abolitionist proclamation, he opined, auspiciously in retrospect, that the Africans were, quote, on the side of the government, unquote. A leading redcoat general concurred and added, "We must avail ourselves of every resource, even to raise the Negroes in our cause." Unquote. Just before June 1772, he was acknowledging that the people of this colony are very anxious. I guess I should do that British voice that they do in Always Sunny. Yes! This time about a bill to lay an additional duty upon the importation of slaves, unquote. A measure devised because there was already just cause to apprehend the most dangerous consequences. A demographic projections. Actually, the issue was not only lessening Africans' number, but even the total expulsion of them, since the proportion of Africans was growing spectacularly, thus imperiling the colonial project. This proportion was said to be sufficient to alarm not only this colony, but all the colonies of America, since, in case of a war with Spain, the people, with great reason, tremble at the prospect of this external force aided by an internal foe. Finding the proper means of averting a calamity so alarming was a priority, he thought. But how could this be done when planters demanded slaves and merchants profited from the same? And as Lord Dunmore was to find, London too might find a specific need for Africans. Colonists should have applauded in 1772, when a regime in Virginia sought to impose taxes on imported Africans, even if they were arriving from Maryland and the Carolinas, for this was effectively limiting the number of those who could slit their throats. But some were too blind to see. Surely, there was still a profit to be made via bonded labor, and this factor tended to override all else. But even before the Edict of November 1775, Lord Dunmore had made decisions that settlers found difficult to applaud. On the 1st of May 1775, for example, his revolt was percolating in Williamsburg. He warned apocalyptically, quote, "I shall be forced, and it is my fixed purpose to arm all my own Negroes and receive all others that will come to me whom I shall declare free," unquote, unless colonists halted their unrest. Like Somerset, this was a direct threat to exalted private property, a threat not only to nationalize this wealth, but to deploy it in armed assaults. It was difficult to imagine words better designed to ignite revolt among a class of settlers who had grown affluent on the basis of tyrannical bigotry. Lord Dunmore, on the other hand, was focused on those who he thought would have been satisfied to cut his own throat. This was part and parcel of the threats against him. Dunmore said, complaining of the dangerous measures pursued by his detractors, "If not treasonable," he thundered, "it was minimally one of the highest insults imaginable." Speaking in May 1775, he knew then that his opponents were apprehensive of insurrections amongst their slaves. Some report have prevailed to this effect. Seeking to soothe them, he purred that he had made gunpowder less accessible, not because of his opponent's behavior, but to keep Africans from seizing it. Not being dupes, the enraged settlers were not buying this notion, and instead, their fury became uncontrollable. In June 1774, Lord Dunmore refused assent to a bill for paying militia with a duty on slaves, a maneuver subject to various interpretations, not all of which left him in a positive light among settlers. His Excellency should have considered events in South Carolina, where the debts of a number of gentlemen escalated when they felt compelled to pay Negro merchants for slaves, while stiffing dry goods merchants. This not only hindered the overall economic growth, it signaled the peril involved in being perceived as tampering with the interests of powerful human traffickers. For example, taxing their commodities as London had done. Even discussing taxes to be imposed by a growingly unpopular leader, not least taxes on enslaved Africans, was bound to incite passion. Typically, as November 1775 approached, rumors of slave conspiracies poured into Williamsburg. And by July 1775, word had reached there about events in neighboring North Carolina and the allegations that Governor Martin was plotting in league with Africans. As these unnerving events were unwinding, Virginia periodicals were bulging about similarly disturbing reports. Africans joining London's Navy in Newport, site of the heralded Gaspé controversy, while other Africans were joining the Redcoats in Boston. Concomitantly, there was a widespread belief among Africans that somehow it was their fate that was driving this tumult, and it was their freedom that settlers wanted to block, and that London was on their side. Surely, the articulate Negroes of that era were appalled by the hypocrisy of slaveholders yelping for liberty while continued to enchain slaves, and thus leaned towards London. Thus, in November 1775, Lord Dunmore in Virginia issued his famous, or infamous, in the view of settlers, edict offering to free and arm Africans to squash an anti-colonial revolt. He entered a pre-existing maelstrom of insecurity about the fate of slavery and London's intentions. For some settlers, this stirred savaging memories of slave insurrections and poisonings, and the overriding concern stretching back to Oliver Cromwell, that somehow London would sacrifice settler interests on the altar with Africans while wielding a sword of retribution. As 1776 approached, the idea was growing in London that if settlers persisted in their escapades, they could be brought to their knees by inciting Africans against them. That Lord Dunmore accompanied this proclamation with a declaration of martial law to confront treasonable settlers and traders was viewed with malignity by settlers. Viewed similarly by the governor's ostensible constituents was his threat of reducing their houses to ashes and spreading devastation wherever he could reach. By speaking so bluntly, the governor helped to convert moderates into radicals. Of course, in November 1775, he was responding to disturbing signs of armed resistance to the crown that had been in motion for more than a year. Thus, when the influential planter London Carter got wind of a, quote, scheme for the Negro Command, he was incredulous, refusing to accord the least credit to a thing so inhumane as well as so dangerous, unquote. Then, with resignation, he accepted the bitter reality. November 1775 was preceded by 19th of April 1775. It was then announced South Carolina rebels that, quote, the actual commencement of hostilities erupted with the Crown at the behest of the British troops in the bloody scene near Boston. But quite tellingly, these patriots instantly linked this fraught moment with the, quote, dread of the instigated insurrections in the colonies, which Lord Dunmore had foreshadowed. And this insightful factor proved, quote, causes insufficient to drive an oppressed people to the use of arms, unquote. Causes sufficient to. By June 1775, the rebels' Continental Congress, a direct challenge to London's sovereignty on the mainland, chose to make inquiry concerning the insurrection of slaves, quote unquote. Settlers from what became the Palmetto State knew that a military attack upon their ranks was often accompanied by an insurrection of the enslaved, eager to take advantage of the resultant flux. Josiah Quincy arrived there just before the epochal battle at Lexington, and remarked pointedly on the, quote, great fears of insurrection that were abundant. In May 1775, as highly motivated delegates assembled at the Continental Congress, one of Charleston's leading figures received word from Arthur Lee, then in London, to the effect that the Crown was planning not only to deploy indigenous allies against the colonists, but, as well, to encourage an insurrection among the slaves. Similar fears arose in Georgia, all of which served to forge in the crucible of independence the entirely understandable idea that Africans were hostile to the formation of the Republic. On the 29th of May, 1775, a local periodical reported a purported plan in London to ship 78,000 guns and bayonets to the colonies for use by Africans, Indigenes, Roman Catholics, and Canadians in order to subdue settlers. When the royal governor arrived in Charleston in 19th of June 1775, he was told that it was believed universally that the ship that brought him had aboard thousands of arms for Africans to effectuate an insurrection. Influenced by events in South Carolina, similar fears arose in Georgia, since by 1775, nearly half of the population was African. Thus, in May 1775, Georgia's governor received news of a skirmish in Boston with alarm, as the report was accompanied by the news that redcoats were on their way to South Carolina and that slaves were being liberated, with the entire region in an uproar of ferment. Colonists were turning en masse against him, and he could envision no other result except an anti-colonial rebellion. Setting aside the veracity of these swirling rumors and allegations, they certainly suggest that an anxiety-ridden state of mind was descending on many settlers as 1776 approached. Frazzled nerves led to hasty decisions, at times wrong-headed, and often violent retribution visited upon those who were seen as a source of insecurity. Africans, for example. Even before the Dunmore Proclamation, colonists were up in arms in light of alleged attempts by the Crown to incite the Africans against them. Hey Christina, welcome comrade. Nevertheless, when 200 Africans instantaneously flocked to the Union Jack after Lord Dunmore's call, panic set in among the settlers, with their erstwhile governor denounced as a tyrant, while Africans viewed him as a liberator. Not the last time that a radical divide emerged over a fundamental matter on the mainland. The edict was far from trivial since, at the time, it was estimated that as many as 2,000 Africans would fight under the Union Jack in response to Lord Dunmore's proclamation. The rebels in response felt obliged to reverse field and allow Negro enlistment in their ranks. As in a repetitive pattern, the alleged tribunes of liberty were moved towards practicing what they preached by those whom they accused of suppressing their liberty. Thus, the edict, says one historian, quote, did more than any other British measure to spur uncommitted white Americans into the camp of rebellion, unquote. The competition in this sweepstakes may have been Lord Mansfield's controversial opinion. Even in New York, where Lord Dunmore once served, angry Long Island farmers burned him in effigy as they fretted about Africans, quote, being too fond of British troops. Contrastingly, the edict reinforced a pre-existing pro-London tendency among Africans, manifested most directly when more of this group fought alongside the Redcoats post-1776 than alongside the successful rebels. Thomas Jefferson claimed that, as of July 1775, separation from Great Britain was not on the settler agenda, but the proclamation was said to have changed all this, turning the temperature towards zealotry. Ironically, this proclamation had a similar impact on what was becoming war, as the Emancipation Proclamation did on another war decades hence. Jefferson had reasons to know, as he was informed directly that great numbers of Africans had flocked to Lord Dunmore, and as a result, quote, the person of no man in the colony is safe, when marked as an object of their vengeance, unquote. Certainly, Jefferson's comrade Patrick Henry was vociferous in his approach to Lord Dunmore, whose edict was said to be, quote, fatal to the public safety and dangerous besides. Dunmore was no fan of Henry, terming him a man of desperate circumstance, who in May 1775 had advanced near the governor's abode and there encamped with all the appearances of actual war. There was growing anarchistic rebellion in the colony, with Lord Dunmore himself barely escaping detention by the rebels. Good job catching that hot dog cake, Bup. However, Patrick Henry and his comrades thought they had reason to wage actual war against the crown. For in August 1775, a patriot preacher in Maryland warned that Lord Dunmore was tampering with the settlers, Negroes, all for the glorious purpose of enticing them to cut their masters' throats while they are asleep. Gracious God, unquote. Somehow, a revolt against London was morphing into a revolt against Africans, and a repetitive pattern that was to stain the resulting republic for decades to come. There were other, more personal motivations that led to this monumentous month. The rowdy rebels had detained Lord Dunmore's spouse, causing her to flee to London by August 1775, while he was hiding out on a ship offshore. Virtually as much as any individual, Lord Dunmore, along with Africans in Antigua and Jamaica, who chased settlers to the mainland, could well be considered a founding father of the Republic. So much loyalist recruiting was occurring among Africans as a result of his edict, to the fury of rebels, that a Connecticut slaveholder advertised that his, quote, Negro wench was now pregnant and bids fair to make more recruits for Lord Dunmore, unquote. On the eve of 1776, there were about 16,000 persons of African descent in New England, who were thought to be potential foes of the anti-London revolt. That slavery was firmly entrenched in this region in 1776 made these fears understandable. Further south in Philadelphia, a headquarters of anti-London feelings, the anger toward Lord Dunmore had attained hyperbolically stratospheric heights, adding highly inflammable fuel to the fires of rebellion. That such rhetoric was echoed in Maryland was indicative of the trepidation induced by his notorious edict. Holy crap! It's a Dave raid! Good day, Dave. Welcome in, comrades. Get comfy. We're reading Gearld Horne Counter-Revolution 1776, Chapter 9. We're right about around the last 10 pages, so get in, get comfortable. My English ain't so working good today. My English no work good today. But I'm trying over here. Sometimes the words are coming out in wrong order sometimes, okay? But I'm trying, I'm still working with it. Get in, get comfortable, follow our comrade Dave Legend. And thank you so much, comrade, for the stream. Very much appreciate you rating me. Hey, March. Hey, woke CIA drone pilot. Hey, Sipatra, welcome, welcome. I hope you comrades are great. I hope your stream was good, Dave. I saw you doing some cursed stream things. I'm sure that was fun for everybody. Now that you're all filled with the Dave legend, allow Larry to read to you. We're just finishing up this chapter 9. Highly cursed and then not so highly cursed. Oh, awesome. I'm assuming you finished up with some Parenti. Speaking of which, we are actually going to be reading Parenti next, by the way. So, should you have me open in an Edge browser? Oh, I don't know. I don't think I'm that edgy. So we're gonna be reading Parenti next once we're done this read.
The revolution that feeds the children gets my support.
We have one more chapter left of this, and then we're going to be getting to Gearld Horne, which is gonna be right here.
To say that socialism doesn't work is to overlook the fact that it did work, and it worked for hundreds of millions of people.
You can get a link to the read right here under Political Library. That's what we're reading next after the Gearld Horne. Now I gotta take off this goddamn window. There. That's what we're reading next, right here. So if you want to get a head start, there's the link in there for you. Hey, Redispy! Type exclamation mark unlurk. Exclamation mark unlurk. God, I'm having trouble speaking today. I'm surprised I've made it this far through the work. I mean, in addition to Firefox, will that help the view count? No, I don't think so. I think it's still, I don't know. I mean, we're fine. We're doing good. Don't worry too much. Just tell people to watch the Leaping Larry stream. That's the best help. Okay. On the east bank of the Atlantic, the feeling was that Lord Dunmore was seen as a nobleman of a firm and resolute disposition, who was treated with respect initially by Virginians, before he became engaged in a violent altercation with them over the whole militia law, which could be seen as a preemptive measure on his part to weaken those who were opposed to London's rule, then to bludgeon them with armed Africans. This supporter of His Excellency knew that the province had a prodigious multitude of Negro slaves, quote unquote, which by his counting amounted to twice the number of the white inhabitants. This imbalance, it was thought, left the latter fearful and desperately desiring a measure that would allow each country to, quote, raise a company for its protection. With the growth in population of Africans and the resultant sense of incipient settler revolt, Dunmore's edict came at a sensitive moment. If his edict could have been seen as a purely local matter, denuded of wider context, the toxic fallout could have been more easily contained. But alas, this was not so, for what motivated Dunmore was part of a larger mainland pattern. The pro-London Thomas Hutchinson knew that in South Carolina, quote, the Negroes are very insolent. He then referred to a controversial case wherein the settlers had tried to free Negro for saying that if the king should send more troops, he would join them, unquote. Thomas Jeremiah may have been innocent of this charge, but his ascendancy and the colonists' incitement helped to condemn him. He was found, quote, guilty of exciting the Negroes to an insurrection, unquote. Then executed. When the colonial governor began to raise an objection, the settlers bluntly informed him that, quote, if he offered to stay execution, they would erect gallows before his door and make him the executioner of the Negro, unquote, in a kind of blood oath that came to solidify the construction of whiteness when lynching became a blood sport decades later. But on one detail, Hutchinson was wrong, or at least premature. Surely, he concluded, such a tyranny cannot last. In a pattern that was to be repeated after the coming of the Republic, it was London that sought aggressively to save the life of this African Jeremiah, before he was hung and cremated on the 18th of August 1775. The royal governor thought his only crime was being a prosperous and free African in a city filled with poor and destitute Europeans, making this episode a harbinger of the lynchings that scarred the landscape in Dixie a century later. Yet, since the governor was warned bluntly that if he intervened, he too might be in jeopardy, his hand was stayed. Nevertheless, one contemporary scholar has a point in asserting that, as matters evolved, the, quote, invading British Army and Low Country blacks shared a common foe in the Republican slave masters of the Low Country, unquote, shedding further light on Jeremiah's execution, his class status as a property owner notwithstanding. In South Carolina in 1775, Africans were thought to outnumber settlers by a ratio of 5 to 3, which only increased the skittish insecurity of the settlers. But it was even more skewed than this. For, according to one source, by 1776, in the 3 low county districts of Georgetown, Charlestown, including the city, and Beaufort, there were 53 slaves to 3 settlers. Reputedly, a leading redcoat played upon this sensitive factor, reminding these settlers of their vulnerability, asserting that if the rebellion continued, quote, it may happen that your rice and indigo will be brought to the market by Negroes instead of white people, unquote. That is, they could be ousted from their high purchase and, in a reversal of fortunes, become subject to the diktat of those whom they were accustomed to ruling. That was March 1775. In May, South Carolina dispatched energized delegates to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Unwittingly, perhaps, London had helped to construct a Black Scare that propelled settlers towards secession, with untoward and unhappy consequences for the Africans left behind when the Crown was defeated. I mean, they should have told white people that. They did tell white people that. This is literally what a redcoat was telling settlers at the time. Which again, as we're seeing all throughout this chapter, only further incited them towards this independency from London. Because they created this Black Scare, essentially. From Philadelphia, William Bradford informed James Madison about a recent quote-unquote Negro conspiracy in Charleston. Oh, they shouldn't have. I mean, it was going that way either way, right? Like, these contradictions were there, and it was going that way. As he pointed out, even before the edict of that lord, it was already heading in this direction. From Philadelphia, William Bradford informed James Madison about a recent quote-unquote Negro conspiracy in Charleston, and word that Virginia would witness the same. Bradford's panic was exacerbated when he considered that Africans thought that the conflict between settlers and London was all about their enslavement, which was not altogether wrong. As for the condemned Thomas Jeremiah, Bradford recited to Madison the chilling words of leading rebel and slave trader, Henry Lawrence, who thought it to be true that the accused was, quote, guilty of a design and attempt to encourage our Negroes to rebellion and joining the king's troops, if any had been sent there. The point was not necessarily if Lawrence was accurate in his sentiment. The point was the state of mind of rebels who were coming to believe that a London African combine was mounting against them, leaving secession, a unilateral declaration of independence, the only way out. I know, I'm just thinking that's exactly what colonizers now think is going to happen with land back, that liberated people are going to subject them to the same things they did. I mean, but that isn't their fear, right? That is overblown, that's rhetoric as far as I'm concerned. In my opinion, they're scared of the actual thing. Which again, like their fears here in 1775 are well founded. They are rightfully scared of the revolts, right? And that is what they're actually scared of. They're not like the rhetoric of them doing the same thing is I think mostly rhetoric. They're actually just scared of losing their colonial system and their own benefits, which is the same reason why white people when they will stand in solidarity with you until something affects their personal lives, and then they will turn into warriors for like bourgeois politicians, despite the harm that brings to colonized communities, for example. This guy actually had the ability to make it happen. I mean, he tried to a degree. He did try to arm them and incite this rebellion. Already, the other prong, because again, he said, any slaves who arrive here, I will arm you and you will be declared free. But again, like that didn't change, that kind of didn't necessarily change the direction things were already headed, as they were already going that way. Just like before the edict, they said like all of the, because it was sort of grounded in a real fear that was happening, especially in the Caribbean, the decades and decades before. Already, the other prong of revolt, settlers' growing economic strength fettered by London, was asserting itself that the direction had been taken by the rebels that no commodities should be exported from the mainland to the British Isles or British Caribbean. This was further transforming the political economy, as one slaveholder in 1775 mandated that no clothing for his property should be imported from the Isles. Instead, 10 black females were to be employed in spinning solely, quote unquote. Still, by making this plantation more dependent upon often seditious slaves, this master was opting for a sour alternative, which was why months later Robert Carter decided that this enterprise was to be carried on by whites only. Lord Dunmore's bold move stirred the pot of unrest irately, on all sides, quickening the pace leading to the 1776 revolt. Yet, his edict should not be viewed in isolation, but as part of a broad tapestry that both illustrated and prefigured his startling words. As I'm saying, for in neighboring North Carolina, the governor had outraged settlers when the rumor was floated that he intended to imitate Lord Dunmore and unleash the Africans against them. Actually, and in private, Governor Josiah Martin conceded that armed Africans could be quite useful in crushing revolt. But he undercut his case among settlers when he suggested that he was against giving encouragement to the Negroes. unless there was an actual and declared rebellion by the dissidents. Crackerfish that these words emerged in August 1775, just weeks before Dunmore, Sting, and Demarche, only contributed to the growing panic among settlers that they were to be overrun shortly, leaving them with few options beyond revolting and tossing aside the crown. The Earl of Dartmouth was correct when he averred the situation of Governor Martin was in many respects similar to that in Virginia, with the prospect of an intercolonial contagion. Irrespective of what London had planned to incite Africans to thrash settlers, many among the latter certainly thought this to be so. Whether theirs was a guilty fear borne by cruel exploitation of Africans is another story altogether. Arthur Lee, as noted, made a similar rabble-rousing claim, and he had been educated in Edinburgh and had practiced law in London. It was assumed widely that there was something to this story. Yet a colonial official branded his assertion as fictitious, although it had inflamed the populace. That the Republic was called into being in part by fear of African insurgency did not bode well for the population that became U.S. Negroes, then African Americans, quote unquote. Still, the proliferating sentiment that Governor Martin was entertaining such utterly inflaming notions helped to tip the scales against him among settlers. The presence there of thousands of Africans, many of them relatively recent arrivals and hardly assimilated to non-violence, was hardly reassuring to settlers. Not for the last time, mainland settlers sought to unite Europeans upon the basis of fear and hatred of Africans. Part of the connective tissue that knitted together an identity that was whiteness. What gave such disquieting claims weight, however, was the unavoidable reality that Somerset had set aloft the notion that London was moving towards abolition, and the settlers not so much. Slave pilots, for example, so useful in navigating the numerous inlets in North Carolina, were among the first to ally with London in its dispute with the settlers. Janet Shaw was passing through North Carolina then and noted that the Edict of the Crown on the 12th of June 1775 had offered a pardon to all rebelling settlers who sought consolation. But somehow, this was not what they heard. Instead, she recalled, they were told London, quote, was ordering the Tories to murder the Whigs and promising every Negro that would murder his master and family that he should have his master's plantation, unquote. And she said somehow the Africans believed this to be true, which meant that a heavy price would be paid. She was stunned to ascertain that an insurrection was hourly expected. There had been a great number of them, meaning Africans, discovered in the adjoining woods the night before, most of them with arms. The notion that it was viewed more as a contagion, I guess, shows in equal parts their really fear and disdain. It also shows their own sense of class awareness. Yeah. Which is funny, like, because there's this sort of like contradiction between their class awareness and the inability to like get out of the contradictions in a suitable way that would have settled everything, right? Like that's impossible because it's this irreconcilable contradiction. So it's like, I mean, London, they realized, many people in London, although many people like got this noble sense that London was doing it because they cared about slaves or something like this, but many of higher up in London, like they understood that it was either they moved towards this abolition and they accept putting Africans in like militia and stuff like that, or they risk the entire colonial project. Fully realizing that in arming Africans and in doing this, they were jeopardizing the colonies in America because they were pushing them towards independency, which they fully realized. It was just a matter of either that or lose the whole British colonial project. And then, as Gearld Horne points out, the settlers' response to London doing this, which was the fight for independency, and then to sort of set aside the religious Cold War that was going on and to perfect the category of whiteness, was ultimately sort of what gave America the strength to then overtake British as the new big. I might be back now. I might be back now. The whites don't want. The whites do not want me reading this to you. I get it. I get it. This is much like Lord. This is a lot like Lord. What's his face is here. It's a lot like Lord. What's his face's edict. You know. I can understand why they would want to do that to us. What happened there? Is fishing disconnected now too? Somebody fish. Okay. No, it's still going. Beautiful. Okay. Let's continue then. Sorry about that. This had forged a remarkably high level of solidarity among settlers and terror against Africans. She was told that this negrophobic artifice was a wily trick intended in the first place to inflame the minds of the populace and, in the next place, to get those who had not before taken up arms to do so now, and form an association for the safety of the town. Even though by this juncture she found it likely that the Negroes will revolt. Unquote. Whatever the case, a signal factor in instigating presumed loyal subjects to become fire-breathing radicals was the very idea that London was stirring a dreaded servile revolt, quote unquote. Convincing settlers that Africans would rise and murder them all was a charge that did not seem far-fetched in light of Manhattan 1712, Antigua 1736, Stono 1739, Manhattan 1741, Jamaican Maroons, and all the rest. That London seemed to be moving towards abolition in 1772, which had been preceded by arming Africans to fight in the Caribbean, gave ballast to the claims made against Governor Martin. Settlers in North America already were rattled when the enslaved African named Sanders was found guilty of having shot a colonist. The defendant, though worth a considerable 80 pounds, was accorded a wrenching verdict. Quote, burn the said Negro alive, quote unquote. Such alarms were consistent with what James Madison thought he knew. For it was in January 1775 that he was informed of a plan by London to emulate Martin and Dunmore by arming the enslaved to squash his revolt. A few months later, the future president shakily referred to, quote, tampering with the slaves, as he alluded to Dunmore's plan to make great use of them in case of an escalating conflict. The truth was, said this diminutive and bookish Virginian, that Dunmore was meddling in the only part in which this colony is vulnerable, if we should be subdued. He warned gravely, we shall fall like Achilles by the hand of one that knows that secret. Unquote. In retrospect, It is hardly stunning how many rebels either anticipated Lord Dunmore's edict before it was written or predicted something similar. All before November 1775, suggesting that it was a logical outgrowth of ongoing trends, including the increasing use of Negro troops from Cartagena to Havana, the perceived unreliability of certain Irish and Scots, the negative reviews of mainlanders' fighting capabilities on behalf of London, the import of Somerset's case, and the like. From the opposite shore, settlers reprimanded Lord Dunmore's proclamation for providing encouragement to a general insurrection, which may threatened unsuitably could mean inflicting the severest punishment upon Africans, making it plain any African so bold as to be involved in conspiring to rebel, a wicked step, were promised death, while being excluded all benefits of clergy. Unquote. Those African soldiers captured in battle were designed for sale as slaves in the Caribbean. Surely an incentive, if any were needed, for the Africans to fight even more ferociously against the settler revolt. Look at this! Look at this! Dunmore was accused of a major sin he had rendered insecure property and had exposed settlers to the dangers of a general insurrection. I see you, Falcon. Dunmore and Martin had become the twin towers of treachery, embodying Dunmore and Martin had become the twin towers of treachery, embodying the direst fears of settlers. They were lumped together with the rebels' sternest London critic, Samuel Johnson, whose words, said Benjamin Franklin, were applauded in Parliament. Supposedly, quote, Lord Dunmore and Governor Martin were already carrying one part of the Johnson project into execution by exciting an insurrection among the blacks, unquote. There is little doubt that Lord Dunmore had tossed shale oil on a raging fire in November 1775. Lord Dunmore's Ethiopians, as they were termed, garnered a form of revenge when they inflicted damage in Virginia, a grand sack of a number of homes, as one observer put it. All this was unfolding in an overheated atmosphere, with rebels worrying that an Indian war is not improbable, alongside the typically dreaded insurrection of slaves. Thus, in early November 1775, Lord Dunmore landed at Norfolk with dozens of grenadiers and a band of loyalists and Africans. There, they confronted successfully rebel militia. Quickly, he issued his edict, and it was downhill from there. By December, a declaration of war by rebels was promulgated. The animosity Dunmore engendered was captured by the Virginian John Norton, who denounced the cruelty and wicked acts of the Crown's forces. After pillaging the plantations on the rivers for some months past, taking Negroes, burning houses, and like depredations, Lord Dunmore capped it all off by issuing a infernal, diabolical proclamation declaring freedom to all our slaves who will join him, unquote. God damn, my bitrate is up and down right now, like wild. What the fuck? I swear we're being attacked. With a few Scots accepted, boasted Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, Dunmore had united every man in the colony. Indeed, if London had searched the world for the man best suited to wreck its cause and procure union and success for the rebels, it could not have been found a more complete agent. He was not far wrong. Intriguingly, one writer also thought that those few who backed Governor Martin in North Carolina also included Highlanders of Scotland and brave and hardy race. Lee could afford to brag because as early as October 1775, the rebels had received by land from Baltimore and other sites substantial amounts of gunpowder, which had been purchased in the Caribbean. Little F's going on? Fucking hell. It's that Megama internet, you see. It's just like money. Just like money. To every 1 bit rate you have, Larry has 0.25 bit rate. And that's why, if you like the Leaping Larry stream, you should consider supporting the Leaping Larry stream with biddies, subs, gift subs, and if you prefer, direct donos, all which keeps our stream going and helps improve that ratio $1 to the 25 cents, 27 cents. It's just like bitrate, just like my bitrate here. I get 0.25 bitrate to every 1 bitrate a white guy gets. Lee was not wrong in his implication that Dunmore was no outlier or loose cannon, but was operating well within the bounds of leadership thinking set down in London. A proposal emerged in Parliament as early as January 1775, calling for the abolition of slavery and thus humbling the high aristocratic spirit of Virginia and the southern colonies, unquote. It was also in November 1775 that a remarkable debate erupted in Parliament as to whether, quote, all the slaves in America should have the trial by jury, unquote. A formal motion was introduced on this terribly fraught manner, accompanied by a proviso to annul all laws on the mainland to the contrary. Amidst pained remarks about a civil war underway, the vice of slavery was denounced. And though instant abolition was not yet on the agenda, clearly designed away stations along the way were. This jury measure was then seen as an auspicious beginning to the end, which was to extirpate slavery from the face of the earth. Tossing down the gauntlet before mainlanders, it was announced brazenly, "Let the only contention henceforth between Great Britain and America be, which shall exceed the other in zeal for establishing the fundamental rights of liberty to all mankind." Unquote. A contest in which London was confident it could easily best those who were enamored with enslavement. But more than noble aims were involved. One official compared the mainland to a chain, the upper part of which was strong and the lower weak, referring to Virginia southward on account of the number of Negroes in them. It was intimidated that, quote, if a few regiments were sent to latter provinces, quote, the Negroes would rise and imbrue their hands in the blood of their masters. Which did not seem overly perturbing and probably underlined why there was opposition expressed to consolatory offers to the rebels. What fueled the intensity of this conflict was the perception in London that the rebels were little more than hypocritical gasbags, a perception fueled by the bruised human property of the latter. It was also in the South, it was said in Parliament, where the spirit of liberty was more high and haughty than elsewhere. That is, precisely where there was a vast multitude of slaves. Where that is the case in any part of the world, those who are free are by far the most proud and jealous of their freedom. Freedom to them, unquote, it was said wisely, is not only an enjoyment, but a kind of rank and privilege, increasing exponentially the profundity of this state. In such a people, it was stated, the haughtiness of domination combines with the spirit of freedom, fortifies it, and renders it invincible, unquote. What to do then? Suggesting that Lord Dunmore might actually have been less radical than some London counterparts, it was suggested to, quote, reduce the mainlanders by declaring a general enfranchisement of their slaves, unquote, with jury trials being a first step. These were radical measures that most U.S. Negroes would not enjoy for decades, suggestive of the growing chasm between the metropolis and the provinces. Was that trial by jury for Africans, discussed in London in 1775, was miles ahead of the civil rights discourse in the emergent republics. In a way, some of the more trenchant critiques of the colonists and their motives for revolt were confirmed by them. The important rebel James Iredell responded angrily in June 1776 to a purported diabolical plan by London of exciting the enslaved to cut colonists' throats and to perpetrate universal massacre. With bitterness, he said knowingly, resentment for such cruel usage had added spurs to her patriotism. Unquote. To a degree, by seeking to enlist the Africans, London exhilarated the resentment of the settlers, leading directly to its substantial losses in what had been a mighty British North America. Hey Bobby, welcome comrade. Shout out to our comrade Bobby, please. I know you're on hiatus, but it's still shouting you out anyway. Never know when you'll be back. Thus, one leading slaveholder had a point in arguing that late acts of Parliament were tending to create a mighty difference between His Majesty's subjects on the mainland and London, leaving settlers with the choice of seeking to continue as free men or become slaves. The slave trope emerged too in May 1775 at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, which embattled South Carolinians attendant, along with John Hancock and other leaders. London's alleged attempt to convert colonists from freemen to slaves was decried heartily. The GASPA was alluded to in referring to hearty efforts to seize Americans and carry them to Great Britain, to be tried for offenses committed in the colonies. Yet, the overarching fright was the horrors of domestic insurrection. Subsequently, John Adams mused about the melancholy account he heard from Georgians and Carolinians, particularly their apprehension that a redcoat offensive would mean that 20,000 Negroes would join them, since the Negroes have a wonderful art of communicating intelligence amongst themselves. Unquote. The saving grace for the rebels was that many allies of the crown too were slaveholders and were reluctant to unsheath the weapon of abolition. Florida, then under British rule, did not join wholly with the 1776 revolt, and provides an indicator of why the Dunmore Edict and the specter of arming Africans was taken so seriously. Because of the Spanish heritage, it became simpler for the governor to create 4 militia companies composed of Africans. During the post-1776 conflict, Africans played a significant role in Florida's defense and in launching offensive raids against Georgia. In June 1772 and November 1775 were powerfully important landmarks on the road to 4th of July 1776, compelling loyal subjects to revolt against the crown, requiring a pervasively profound threat to the colonist status quo. And the rapidly changing status of the Africans was tantamount to such a threat. The dilemma for Africans who sensed that freedom and an enhanced life were more likely to come from the metropolis as opposed to the rebels, who had devised a model of development based on their mass enslavement, was that if their understandable alliance with London did not pan out as conflict with the rebels sharpened, they would be bereft, surrounded by a sea of hostile U.S. patriots eager to pulverize those who, in their minds, had engaged in the darkest of betrayals. And that brings us to the final chapter, which we will do next time. Chapter 10, The Counter-Revolution of 1776.